Imagine standing in an open plain, the evening sky burning with shades of orange and gold, when suddenly a massive shadow sweeps across the ground. It isn't a bird, nor a plane, but a creature with wings as long as a football field, dominating the skies millions of years ago. For decades, we've been told the name Quetzalcoatlus, a pterosaur from Texas, was the ultimate ruler of prehistoric skies, the largest animal ever to fly. But here's the shocking truth. Quetzalcoatlus wasn't alone, and it might not even have been the biggest. There is another contender, one far stranger, far less well known, but possibly just as gigantic, Hatzegopteryx, a mysterious pterosaur from Transylvania. As paleontologist Mark Whitten notes in his book Pterosaurs, Natural History, Evolution and Anatomy, 2013, the debate over which creature truly deserves the crown of largest flying animal is far from settled. Quetzalcoatlus may have captured the public imagination thanks to its exotic name and discovery in the United States, but Hatzegopteryx hides a much darker story. A creature that may not only have ruled the skies, but also terrorized the ground it walked upon. This is the beginning of a paleontological mystery, one about an animal seemingly built to defy the limits of flight itself. Now, picture yourself on a lonely island 70 million years ago in what we now call Romania. The land is small, cut off from the continents, a world of evolutionary oddities shaped by isolation. This was the domain of Hatzegopteryx, a pterosaur with wingspans estimated between 10 and 12 meters, a skull the size of a horse, and a neck that was short yet unbelievably thick, granting it a bite force far more brutal than Quetzalcoatlus. It was as if the sky itself struggled to contain its monstrous body. Michael Habib, a specialist in the biomechanics of flight, wrote in PLOS One, 2008, that Ausdeutsche pterosaurs like Hatzegopteryx evolved hollow but incredibly strong bones, blending the grace of flight with the terrifying potential of ground-based predation. And this is what made Hatzegopteryx so frightening. It could soar through the skies, but also act as a dominant predator on the ground, seizing control of an entire island ecosystem. If Quetzalcoatlus is the celebrity of the pterosaur world, then Hatzegopteryx is its shadow monster, rarely discussed, but infinitely more disturbing once you understand its capabilities. And that is the journey we are about to take. The story of the largest flying creature in history, which, as it turns out, wasn't Quetzalcoatlus at all. The real question is, are you ready to uncover the terrifying secrets of a beast that seemed to break the laws of nature itself?
To grasp the magnitude of the story, we first need to set aside the romantic image of dinosaurs and other prehistoric icons, because pterosaurs, though they lived alongside dinosaurs, were not dinosaurs themselves. They were the first vertebrates to truly conquer the air, millions of years before modern birds took flight. And among all pterosaurs, one family stood out as the most extraordinary, the Azhdarchidae. With their enormous wingspans, elongated skulls, and lightweight yet muscular bodies, these creatures were not just a marvel of evolution, but living proof that nature once produced beings that seem impossible today. As Gregory S. Paul highlights in the Princeton Field Guide to Pterosaurs, 2022, Azhdarchids like Hatzegopteryx represent the pinnacle of pterosaur adaptation, perfectly designed to function both as long-distance flyers and as opportunistic predators on the ground. Imagine one of them standing at the edge of a swamp, its body towering as high as a giraffe, its head the size of a doorway, each step sending ripples of fear through the smaller creatures hiding in the reeds. This wasn't just about size, it was about dominance. One animal with the ability to rule both air and land, holding complete authority over a fragile island ecosystem. What makes Hatzegopteryx even more fascinating, however, is the mystery that surrounds its fossils. Unlike Quetzalcoatlus, which has been found in relatively complete remains, Hatzegopteryx is known mostly from fragments of its skull and neck. But those fragments are enough to astonish paleontologists. Its skull bones are thick and solid, unlike the paper-thin skulls of most other pterosaurs. Its neck, instead of being long and slender like its relatives, was short but nearly as thick as a tree trunk, suggesting immense strength and an ability to subdue prey larger than anything typically hunted by flying reptiles. In their 2002 paper, Hatzegopteryx, an Azhdarchid pterosaur giant from the Upper Cretaceous of Romania, Darren Naish and Gareth Dyke proposed that this anatomy reveals Hatzegopteryx as a top predator in its environment, something virtually unheard of among pterosaurs. It was as if evolution had created not just a giant bird-like reptile, but a living dragon that walked the earth. And when we realize that such a creature truly existed, we are left with a haunting thought. If Hatzegopteryx dominated both air and land, are we looking at one of the most perfect predators evolution has ever produced?
The story of Hatzegopteryx begins not with a dramatic skeleton rising from the earth, but with fragments, shards of bone so unusual that, at first, paleontologists weren't even sure what they were looking at. It was the early 1990s, in the Hațeg Basin of Transylvania, Romania, a place already famous for its bizarre island dinosaurs. Here, the French paleontologist Eric Buffetot and his team uncovered pieces of skull and neck vertebrae that defied expectations. These bones weren't thin and delicate, as one would expect from a flying reptile. Instead, they were massive, thick, and reinforced like armor plating. In 2002, Buffetot, alongside Darren Naish and colleagues, formally named the animal Hatzegopteryx thambema, which translates roughly to Hațeg Basin wing, the beast. The name is telling. It not only situates the creature in its geographical home, but also emphasizes its monstrous, almost otherworldly presence. According to their groundbreaking paper published in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology 2002, this discovery challenged the prevailing idea of pterosaurs as fragile giants. Hatzegopteryx was anything but fragile. Picture the scene. The quiet hills of modern-day Romania, farmers tilling the soil as they had for generations, only for scientists to arrive and reveal that beneath their feet lay the remnants of the largest flyers ever known. At first, the fossils were so fragmented that some paleontologists wondered if they belonged to a theropod dinosaur rather than a pterosaur. After all, how could a flying reptile have bones so thick? But careful analysis of the skull's pneumatic structure, the internal air sacs that reduced weight while maintaining strength, confirmed it as an Azhdarchid pterosaur. Its discovery was a turning point for paleontology in Eastern Europe. Unlike North America, where Quetzalcoatlus had already been celebrated since its discovery in Texas during the 1970s, Romania's Hațeg Basin was relatively obscure. Suddenly, it wasn't just another site with small, dwarfed dinosaurs. It was home to a monster of the skies. The naming of Hatzegopteryx symbolized not just a taxonomic classification, but the beginning of a scientific reevaluation. Perhaps the title of the largest flying animal in history didn't belong to Quetzalcoatlus alone. And that thought, at the time, was almost unthinkable. What made Hatzegopteryx's discovery even more compelling was the setting in which it was found. The Hațeg Basin is one of the most extraordinary paleontological sites on Earth, a place where isolation during the late Cretaceous created a miniature lost world. Dinosaurs here were often dwarfed due to limited resources, a phenomenon called insular dwarfism. Yet within this land of small creatures, scientists uncovered the remains of a truly colossal flyer. The irony is striking. On an island dominated by pint-sized hadrosaurs, dwarf titanosaurs, and tiny predators, Hatzegopteryx stood as a towering giant. Its name, thambema, meaning beast in Greek,
captured this paradox perfectly. As Neisch and Dyke 2002 emphasized in their study, this wasn't just a large pterosaur, it was an apex animal in an environment where such giants shouldn't have existed. Its naming thus became an act of recognition, a declaration that this was no ordinary fossil find, but evidence of a creature that rewrote our understanding of pterosaur diversity. Visualize a dusty excavation pit in the Romanian countryside. Teams of paleontologists carefully brush away layers of sediment, the sun beating down, villagers watching curiously from a distance. Then a jaw fragment emerges, thick, robust, unlike any known pterosaur at the time. Each new fragment was a revelation, a vertebra here, a section of skull there, until the image of a massive flying predator began to take shape. Unlike Quetzalcoatlus, whose remains were found in broad North American badlands and quickly became world-famous, Hatzegopteryx had a quieter birth into science. Its unveiling was almost intimate, shared by only a handful of specialists who recognized its significance. But the power of its name ensured it would not remain in obscurity for long. To call it Hatzegopteryx was to tie it forever to the land that gave rise to its legend, the land of Hatzeg, where nature's rules bent in strange ways. It was more than just nomenclature. It was storytelling through taxonomy, the christening of a prehistoric phantom that had haunted the skies of Europe 70 million years ago. And with its name secured in the annals of science, one question loomed larger than ever. Just how big could this creature have been?
When it comes to size, few creatures in the history of life on Earth capture the imagination quite like Hatzegopteryx. To call it simply large would be an understatement. It was colossal, dwarfing almost anything else that ever took to the skies. Estimates of its wingspan range from 10 to 12 meters. That's as wide as a small private jet. To put this into perspective, the largest modern bird, the wandering albatross, stretches its wings to around 3.5 meters, and even that seems enormous when encountered in the wild. Hatzegopteryx was at least 3 times wider, a behemoth whose shadow would have darkened entire clearings. According to Mark Whitten in Dinosaurs 2013, these proportions place Hatzegopteryx at the absolute pinnacle of vertebrate flight, making it one of the largest known flying animals of all time. Its skull alone measured nearly 3 meters long, a monstrous spear-like structure longer than the height of most adult humans. Imagine standing next to that skull, its beak pointed downward, the jaws wide enough to swallow a small deer in one bite. It is no wonder that when paleontologists reconstructed its proportions, they struggled to comprehend how such a creature could even exist. But what made Hatzegopteryx especially terrifying was not just the width of its wings, it was its overall build. Quetzalcoatlus, for example, is often imagined as tall and slender, with long, stilt-like limbs. Hatzegopteryx, on the other hand, had a more robust frame, with a neck that was thicker and shorter than its cousins, and bones reinforced to support enormous stress. This sturdiness suggests it was not a delicate glider, but an animal built for raw power. Darren Naish, in his analyses of Ajdarchid anatomy, describes Hatzegopteryx as unusually stocky compared to its relatives, with adaptations that gave it a far more imposing ground presence. If Quetzalcoatlus resembled a stork scaled to monstrous size, then Hatzegopteryx was more like a nightmare heron crossed with a dragon. Its towering height likely rivaled that of a giraffe, and its weight is estimated at 250 kilograms or more, balanced on hollow but heavily reinforced bones. Visualize it landing in a clearing, wings folding inward with the sound of sails snapping in the wind, its massive body settling onto limbs that seemed impossibly slender for the bulk they carried. This paradox of size and lightness, fragile yet unbreakable, defined its very existence.
Yet sheer size tells only part of the story.
The significance of Hatzegopteryx's dimensions lies in what they meant for its lifestyle and ecological role. Imagine a creature tall enough to look humans directly in the eye if it were alive today, its head rising above most animals in its environment. On Hatzeg Island, where most dinosaurs were miniaturized by the pressures of insular dwarfism, Hatzegopteryx was a giant among runts. This gave him an overwhelming advantage. It could stalk the landscape almost unchallenged, towering over the small hadrosaurs and dwarf titanosaurs that shared its world. Gregory Paul, in the Princeton Field Guide to Pterosaurs 2022, highlights that its size made it not just an apex flyer, but potentially an apex predator on land, a role that virtually no other flying animal has ever filled. Its massive head, combined with a neck that could withstand tremendous force, allowed it to seize prey far larger than a bird of prey could ever dream of capturing. Where an eagle might carry off a rabbit, Hatzegopteryx could conceivably snap up an animal the size of a horse. From a visual standpoint, the size of Hatzegopteryx creates a sense of surreal horror. Picture a human standing in a field, craning their neck upward as the pterosaur's wings unfold, stretching wider than the wingspan of an F-16 fighter jet. The animal then lowers its head, a spear-shaped beak descending slowly, its eye, nearly the size of a grapefruit, fixing on its target. In that moment, one realizes that size isn't just about physical measurements. It's about dominance, about creating an atmosphere of helplessness in everything smaller. The size of Hatzegopteryx raises one of the most fascinating questions in paleontology. How could such a massive animal achieve flight at all? Engineers and biologists have long debated whether the limits of muscle strength and bone structure would even allow something this big to take off. And yet the fossil evidence tells us it did. As Michael Habib explained in his Biomechanical Studies, 2008, pterosaurs likely launched themselves using all four limbs, catapulting their massive frames into the air with explosive power. This makes their size not just impressive, but paradoxical, living machines that seem to defy physics. And as we stand in awe of their measurements, another question inevitably arises. How did they manage to grow so enormous in the first place?
The question that inevitably arises when we confront the sheer immensity of Hatzegopteryx is simple yet profound. How could anything that massive evolve to fly? The answer lies not in a single miracle of biology, but in a complex interplay of evolutionary pressures, environmental opportunities, and anatomical innovations. To begin, we must remember that Hatzegopteryx lived during the late Cretaceous, roughly 70 million years ago, a time when the world was warmer, seas were higher, and ecosystems were flourishing with diversity. The Hatzeg Island environment was particularly unusual. It was isolated, resource-limited, and home to dwarfed dinosaurs, many of which were considerably smaller than their mainland counterparts. Into this strange ecological theater stepped the Ajdarchids, a family of pterosaurs that had already evolved extreme adaptations for large body sizes. Their bones, though hollow like those of birds, were reinforced with intricate internal struts, a structure paleontologists called trabeculae. According to Mark Whitten in Pterosaurs, Natural History, Evolution, Anatomy, 2013, this honeycomb-like arrangement allowed bones to be incredibly strong, yet remarkably lightweight, the key innovation that made giant flyers possible. Without it, a creature the size of Hatzegopteryx would have collapsed under its own weight long before it ever left the ground. But bone structure was only part of the story. The evolutionary arms race of the Cretaceous also encouraged giantism in pterosaurs because size conferred distinct advantages. Large wings allowed them to soar long distances with minimal effort, exploiting thermal updrafts and covering vast territories in search of food. Their size also offered dominance over ecosystems. Small animals would have been defenseless against a predator towering above them, while even medium-sized dinosaurs would have been cautious around such giants. In his 2008 paper in PLOS One, Michael Habib argued that large pterosaurs achieved takeoff not by flapping alone, but by a unique
quadrupedal launch mechanism. Using both their wings and hind limbs, like powerful catapults, they could vault their enormous bodies into the air with explosive strength. This adaptation meant that the larger they grew, the more energy-efficient long-distance flight became, provided they had enough space and power to launch. In essence, giantism was not a liability, but a strategy. The bigger they were, the safer, more efficient, and more dominant they became. Hatzegopteryx' immense size was the result of millions of years of refinement, a testament to how evolution can stretch the boundaries of possibility until it brushes against the very laws of physics.
Still, gigantism didn't occur in isolation. It required the perfect balance of environment and adaptation. On Hatzeg Island, where predators were relatively scarce and most dinosaurs were reduced in size due to limited resources, Hatzegopteryx filled a vacant ecological niche. Unlike mainland ecosystems where competition from giant theropods or massive crocodilians might have limited its dominance, the island presented fewer challenges. Here, gigantism wasn't just possible, it was advantageous. Darren Naish and Gareth Dyke, in their 2002 paper on Hatzegopteryx, argued that its anatomy was uniquely adapted not just for flying, but also for terrestrial predation. Its reinforced skull and thick neck indicate that it didn't rely solely on scavenging or fish hunting like many smaller pterosaurs. Instead, it likely attacked larger prey on the ground, possibly including juvenile titanosaurs or medium-sized hadrosaurs. By growing so large, Hatzegopteryx effectively became both the aerial overlord and the terrestrial apex predator of its environment, a dual dominance almost unparalleled in prehistory. Imagine the evolutionary stage like a grand performance. Most creatures adapt within narrow constraints, playing specialized roles to survive. But Hatzegopteryx was the exception, the superstar of its ecosystem, breaking the usual rules. Its gigantism wasn't a random accident of nature, it was a carefully honed response to opportunity. The warm Cretaceous climate provided abundant thermals for soaring. Its island ecosystem provided less competition from larger land predators. Its skeletal architecture, perfected over millions of years of asdarchid evolution, gave it the framework to support enormous size without succumbing to fragility. It is almost as though Hatzegopteryx evolved at the intersection of multiple golden factors, a convergence of climate, ecology, and anatomy that allowed it to transcend the limitations faced by other animals. When we consider these forces together, the rise of Hatzegopteryx seems less like a biological fluke and more like nature's deliberate experiment. How far can life push the limits of flight? And as we reflect on that, the haunting question emerges: if evolution could create a flying predator this large once, could it have happened again, somewhere else in Earth's vast history, leaving behind no fossils for us to find?
If there is one feature that truly sets Hatzegopteryx apart from all other pterosaurs, it is its grotesque head and neck, an anatomical design so strange and unsettling that paleontologists have compared it to a patchwork monstrosity, a Frankenstein of evolution. Most asdarchids, including its famous cousin Quetzalcoatlus, had long, slender necks, often likened to storks or herons, scaled up to titanic proportions. Their skulls were elongated and lightweight, adapted for snatching fish or probing for small prey. But Hatzegopteryx was different. Its skull, reconstructed from fragments found in the Hatzeg Basin, was nearly 3 meters long, with a beak as robust as a spear and reinforced bone walls far thicker than those of other pterosaurs. According to Darren Naish and Eric Buffeteau in their seminal study, Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology, 2002, the cranial bones of Hatzegopteryx were unusually dense, with internal struts that created an almost lattice-like reinforcement. This meant its skull could withstand far greater stresses than the fragile paper-thin skulls of typical pterosaurs. Instead of being designed for delicate probing, this head was engineered for violence, slamming, crushing, and tearing prey apart. Now, add to that the neck. Where most asdarchids had spindly necks that could stretch gracefully but offered limited resistance, Hatzegopteryx's cervical vertebrae were short, thick, and immensely powerful. Imagine a tree trunk rather than a reed. Its neck was built less like a stork's and more like a bulldog's, sacrificing length for raw strength. Paleontologists studying its vertebrae noted that the neural spines and muscle attachment sites suggested immense musculature, making it capable of exerting brutal force in head movements. This Frankenstein combination, an oversized, heavy-duty skull mounted on a reinforced neck, created an apex predator unlike anything else in its environment. Visually, it must have looked bizarre, a giant reptilian bird with a head far too large for its body, its short, thick neck bulging with muscle, ready to strike down on anything within reach. And yet, this apparent deformity was exactly what made it so efficient. A reminder that nature often builds monsters by bending the rules of proportion.
The implications of this monstrous anatomy are chilling. With such a reinforced head and neck, Hatzegopteryx could likely kill prey that no other flying animal in history would even attempt to tackle. Darren Naish, in later writings 2013, suggested that the reinforced skull allowed Hatzegopteryx to prey upon animals nearly as large as itself, an astonishing claim when you consider that even the most formidable modern birds of prey are limited to small mammals or fish. Picture a hadrosaur calf grazing along the island's edge, its parents absent or distracted. From above, the shadow of Hatzegopteryx sweeps silently across the ground. With a sudden lunge, the pterosaur drops from the sky, folding its enormous wings, and with one devastating snap of its reinforced jaws, seizes the struggling dinosaur. Its neck does not bend or fracture under the strain. Instead, the thick vertebrae and dense musculature hold firm, driving the beak downward with the force of a pile driver. Within moments, the calf is subdued, dragged away in the monster's jaws. This was no delicate fisher of streams, no scavenger of carcasses. This was a top-level predator, enabled entirely by its grotesque Frankenstein anatomy. And here lies the paradox. What at first glance seems impractical, an absurdly oversized head and an ungainly thick neck, was actually an evolutionary masterstroke. The Hatzeg Island ecosystem, dominated by smaller prey due to insular dwarfism, provided the perfect hunting grounds for such a predator. Most of its potential victims were far weaker and less imposing than mainland dinosaurs, making them ideal targets for a creature with brute force cranial weaponry. Gregory Paul, in the Princeton Field Guide to Pterosaurs 2022, described Hatzegopteryx's morphology as an example of functional gigantism, an animal that stretched the limits of evolutionary design, not for elegance, but for raw efficiency. If Quetzalcoatlus was the elegant giant of the skies, then Hatzegopteryx was its twisted reflection, a monstrous brute whose head and neck defied conventional proportions. And as we picture this bizarre creature looming above the Cretaceous landscape, we cannot help but wonder, was this distorted anatomy a one-time evolutionary experiment? Or could nature have repeated the trick elsewhere, giving rise to predators we have yet to uncover in the fossil record?
To truly grasp the terror of Hatzegopteryx, we must confront one of the most unsettling possibilities suggested by its anatomy. It may have been not just the largest flyer in history, but also a genuine dinosaur killer. At first, the very idea sounds absurd. How could a flying reptile, however large, dare to challenge creatures that we traditionally associate with raw power, dinosaurs? But the fossil evidence tells a different story. The Hatzeg Basin was home to dwarf titanosaurs, smaller hadrosaurs, and juvenile dinosaurs that were significantly reduced in size compared to their mainland relatives. This peculiar ecosystem offered an almost perfect buffet for a predator the size of Hatzegopteryx. Darren Naish and Gareth Dyke, in their 2002 study of Hatzegopteryx, argued that its reinforced skull and thickened neck vertebrae indicate it could tackle prey far larger than the small fish and mammals usually associated with pterosaur diets. This wasn't an animal restricted to scavenging carcasses or picking at scraps. Its weaponized head and colossal strength meant it could actively hunt down juvenile dinosaurs, killing them with swift, devastating strikes. Imagine the scene. A herd of dwarf hadrosaurs grazes quietly in the meadows of Hatzeg Island. They are wary, constantly scanning for danger, but no giant theropods stalk these lands, only smaller predators. Suddenly, from above, the shadow of something enormous sweeps across the ground. The hadrosaurs scatter, but for one unlucky juvenile, it is already too late. With wings folded tight, Hatzegopteryx drops from the sky like a guillotine, slamming its beak into the prey with bone-cracking force. The young dinosaur thrashes, but the predator's immense neck muscles pin it down, driving the spear-like jaws deeper. Within moments, the fight is over. The herd flees, leaving behind only the silent proof that the skies themselves can be just as deadly as the land. This hunting style, stalking from above, swooping down, and using brute cranial strength, would have made Hatzegopteryx an apex predator unique in natural history, a flying reptile that hunted dinosaurs as its primary food source. And in this image lies the chilling truth. On Hatzeg Island, even the dinosaurs had something to fear.
What makes the case even more compelling is the comparison with modern ecosystems. Today, no flying animal preys on creatures larger than itself. Even the most formidable eagles or condors restrict themselves to small mammals, reptiles, or carrion. But Hatzegopteryx was built differently. Its immense size, crushing bite force, and reinforced skull were precisely the adaptations needed to subdue prey that might weigh hundreds of kilograms. In Pterosaurs 2013, Mark Whitten points out that azhdarchids were not fishers like many imagined, but likely terrestrial stalkers. Creatures that walked the land, scanning for prey, and then striking with terrifying precision. Hatzegopteryx, as the largest and most robust of them all, took the strategy to its extreme. It could stride confidently across open plains, towering like a giraffe, and use its long stride to pursue smaller dinosaurs. Once within range, its enormous head functioned as both spear and bludgeon, delivering fatal blows that would overwhelm even a struggling juvenile titanosaur. Visualize it this way: a predator that combined the stealth of a bird of prey with the brute strength of a land carnivore, capable of exploiting both sky and ground. There was no safe refuge for its victims. If they tried to hide in thickets, its towering head could probe into the underbrush. If they fled into open spaces, its wings gave it the ability to cover ground quickly, launching into short bursts of flight to close the distance. On an island where resources were limited and niches compressed, Hatzegopteryx may have evolved into the ultimate opportunist, killing, scavenging, and dominating without rival. This challenges our very definition of what a flying animal could be. Rather than a fragile giant clinging to survival, Hatzegopteryx was the terror of its world, a predator that blurred the line between sky and land. And perhaps the most haunting thought of all is this: if a flying creature could grow large enough, strong enough, and predatory enough to hunt dinosaurs, then the boundaries of evolutionary possibility are far wider and far more terrifying than we ever imagined.
While juvenile dinosaurs may have been the most dramatic prey items on Hatzegopteryx's menu, they were far from the only ones. To survive as a giant predator on an isolated island,
Hatzegopteryx had to be an opportunist. The fossil record from the Hatzeg Basin suggests a landscape filled with smaller creatures. Dwarf titanosaurs no taller than an elephant, hadrosaur hatchlings, small crocodilomorphs, amphibians, mammals, and even large lizards. Any of these could have fallen victim to the shadow of Hatzegopteryx. Its colossal skull with that spear-like beak wasn't designed for one specialized form of hunting. It was a universal weapon, equally capable of stabbing, crushing, or tearing. In the Princeton Field Guide to Pterosaurs, Gregory Paul, 2022, Asgurkids are described as generalist predators that used their long pointed jaws to seize whatever was available. Hatzegopteryx, being the most extreme of them all, likely embodied this principle to the fullest. Imagine it stalking a riverbank, watching a cluster of turtles sunning themselves. With one swift jab, its massive head lunges forward, seizing a struggling reptile. The reinforced skull and powerful neck drive the beak through shell and bone alike. Just as quickly, the prey disappears into the predator's massive gullet. This opportunism made Hatzegopteryx not just a dinosaur hunter, but a terror to nearly everything that shared its island. No mammal could escape it. Even the burrowing creatures would have been at risk when the giant's probing beak dug into the soil. Fish and aquatic reptiles in shallow waters likely fell prey as well, plucked from the surface like oversized insects. And unlike Quetzalcoatlus, which some paleontologists suggest may have relied more heavily on scavenging, Hatzegopteryx had the physical robustness to actively kill its food rather than wait for it to die. Darren Naish, in later discussions of Asgurkid ecology, pointed out that their hunting behavior may have been similar to modern ground stalkers like storks and herons, but magnified to monstrous proportions. Where a stork snatches frogs, Hatzegopteryx snatched dinosaurs. Where a heron spears fish, Hatzegopteryx might have skewered a struggling crocodilian. This adaptability made it not just a predator, but a near unstoppable force, an apex animal capable of feeding on almost any available prey source. On Hatzeg Island, this meant Hatzegopteryx didn't merely survive, it dominated.
Visualizing the variety of prey also helps us understand the ecological role of Hatzegopteryx. It wasn't a specialist locked into one niche, but rather a predator with a flexible strategy that ensured survival even when resources fluctuated. Picture a day on Hatzeg Island. In the morning, Hatzegopteryx stalks the forests, its towering head weaving among the trees as it searches for unwary mammals. Later, it strides across open plains, towering over dwarf sauropods, waiting for a calf to stray too far from the herd. By evening, it patrols the edges of a swamp, its beak poised to snatch a giant amphibian surfacing for air. Each environment provided new opportunities, and Hatzegopteryx had the size, strength, and versatility to exploit them all. Mark Witten's Pterosaurs 2013 describes asdargids as terrestrial stalkers rather than mere flyers, and when applied to Hatzegopteryx, this interpretation becomes chilling. Its wings allowed it to move between hunting grounds with ease, but its real power lay in its ability to kill on the ground. Unlike modern birds of prey that rely on talons, Hatzegopteryx relied on sheer cranial violence. Its head was its primary weapon, a killing tool capable of dispatching creatures across multiple ecosystems. And this raises a fascinating perspective. Hatzegopteryx was not just a dinosaur killer, but a universal predator, one that blurred the lines between categories. It could behave like a raptor when swooping down on small animals, like a stork when stalking wetlands, and like a big cat when striking down larger prey on land. In evolutionary terms, this was extraordinary. No other flying creature, before or since, has demonstrated such dominance across multiple food chains. Modern birds of prey, no matter how powerful,
are still constrained by their size. Even the most formidable eagle cannot bring down an antelope, but Hatzegopteryx broke this rule. It lived in a world where its sheer scale and reinforced anatomy gave it free rein to prey on almost anything smaller than itself. When we think of other prey, we aren't just imagining a supplement to its diet. We are imagining a terrifying reminder that nothing on Hatzeg Island was truly safe. The dinosaurs, the mammals, the reptiles, even the fish all lived under the constant, looming threat of a predator that ruled both sky and land. And the haunting question is, how do you escape something that can kill you from above and then stalk you relentlessly on the ground?
The question that has haunted paleontologists for decades is deceptively simple. How could something as massive as Hatzegopteryx even fly? At first glance, the very idea seems to defy physics. A creature with a wingspan of up to 12 meters, a skull nearly 3 meters long, and a body weight estimated at 200 to 250 kilograms, surely such a beast would be earthbound, too heavy for the fragile mechanics of flight. Yet the fossil record is clear. Hatzegopteryx was a pterosaur, part of a lineage that evolved to master the skies. The secret lies in its anatomy, particularly the extraordinary adaptations of its bones and musculature. Like other pterosaurs, Hatzegopteryx had hollow bones, but unlike birds, these bones were reinforced with internal struts, creating a honeycomb-like architecture that gave them immense strength without adding weight. In his biomechanical studies, Michael Habib, 2008 +1, proposed that such structural reinforcement was crucial in allowing giant pterosaurs to remain airborne. Their wings weren't simply stretched skin, they were vast muscular membranes supported by elongated fourth fingers, capable of withstanding enormous aerodynamic stress. This combination of lightness and resilience turned what might have been a clumsy monster into an efficient glider of astonishing proportions. But launching into the air was perhaps the greatest challenge. Large birds like albatrosses and condors struggled to take off, requiring strong winds or cliff edges to give them lift. If Hatzegopteryx had relied on similar methods, it would have been hopelessly vulnerable, grounded without perfect conditions. Instead, pterosaurs evolved a unique solution: the quadrupedal launch. Habib's research suggested that these giants used all 4 limbs to spring into the air. Imagine Hatzegopteryx crouching low, wings folded, then vaulting forward with a sudden explosive push from both powerful legs and enormous wing arms, catapulting itself skyward. This launch mechanism, unlike the bipedal takeoff of birds, gave it the raw power to overcome the limits of its size. Once airborne, the massive wings could catch thermals, rising columns of warm air that lifted the creature higher and allowed it to glide effortlessly over vast distances. In this sense, Hatzegopteryx wasn't a bird-like flyer, but more akin to a living sailplane, capable of soaring for hours with minimal energy. The skies of the late Cretaceous, warmer and more turbulent than today, would have been filled with rising air currents, perfect highways for a creature that ruled the winds. Thus, what seems impossible at first glance becomes believable. Flight was not only possible for Hatzegopteryx, but it was the very foundation of its dominance.
Still, imagining Hatzegopteryx in flight requires us to abandon familiar comparisons with modern birds. Its sheer scale makes analogies inadequate. When it launched into the air, the beating of its wings would have sounded like sails cracking in a storm, each downstroke generating enough force to rattle the ground below. Once it caught a thermal, its wings stretched wide like a living glider, and it would drift silently over forests and plains, scanning for prey with its piercing eyes. Picture the terror of smaller animals below, aware that at any moment the massive shadow overhead could fold its wings and plummet like a spear. Unlike birds, which rely heavily on flapping flight, Hatzegopteryx likely depended more on soaring, conserving energy while covering immense distances. Mark Whitten, in
Pterosaurs 2013 emphasized that Asdarchids were long-range travelers capable of patrolling territories that spanned tens or even hundreds of kilometers. For Hatzegopteryx, this meant its reign wasn't confined to a single valley or swamp. It could dominate an entire island ecosystem from the sky. But flight wasn't just about hunting, it also provided safety. While few predators on Hatzeg Island could challenge a fully grown Hatzegopteryx, flight gave it the ultimate advantage of escape and mobility. If resources dwindled in one part of the island, it could soar to another. If prey herds shifted with the seasons, it could follow them with ease. This mobility combined with its predatory power made it virtually untouchable. No land predator could match its reach, and no prey could ever feel safe under its shadow. And yet flight also came with limits. Hatzegopteryx probably couldn't maneuver through dense forests or chase prey in tight spaces. Instead, it relied on open clearings, shorelines, and plains, landscapes where its massive wings could spread freely. This specialization made its hunting scenes dramatic but also predictable. A giant looming above open ground, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In many ways, Hatzegopteryx was less a bird than a flying fortress, gliding with serene grace until the instant it transformed into a lightning bolt of violence. And here lies the unsettling beauty of its design. Flight was not a fragile dream, but a deadly weapon. The mechanism that allowed the largest predator of its ecosystem to rule both the air and the earth. Which leaves us with the next question. What kind of world could support such a terrifying flyer? And what was the island environment like that gave birth to this sky monster?
To understand Hatzegopteryx, we must first understand its stage, the peculiar and mysterious Hatzeg Island. 70 million years ago, during the late Cretaceous, Europe was not the unified continent we know today. Instead, it was an archipelago of islands scattered across a warm, shallow sea, much like modern-day Indonesia or the Caribbean. Among these islands was Hatzeg, located in what is now Romania. This island was not vast, but its isolation shaped evolution in strange ways, producing what paleontologists call island dwarfism. Large animals, constrained by limited resources, shrank dramatically in size. Titanosaurs that elsewhere grew into 30-ton giants were reduced here to dwarf sauropods, no bigger than elephants. Hadrosaurs, normally towering and formidable, became smaller, more fragile versions of themselves. Even predators were downsized, creating an ecosystem of miniatures. A land of giants shrunk to toy-like proportions. Yet, in the midst of these scaled-down dinosaurs, rose a towering anomaly, Hatzegopteryx, a predator whose size defied the rules of island biology. As Darren Naish and Gareth Dyke observed in their 2002 paper, the coexistence of insular dwarfs with one of the largest flying predators in history was both a paradox and a revelation. The island that shrank most creatures somehow produced a titan of the skies. Now imagine walking across this island. The landscape was a patchwork of lush floodplains, volcanic hills, and winding rivers. Ferns and cycads grew thick in the lowlands, while conifers dotted higher ground. Swamps buzzed with amphibians, turtles basked in the shallows, and small mammals scurried beneath the foliage. Everywhere you looked, dinosaurs were present, but they were not the colossal beasts you'd expect. Instead, you'd see herds of dwarf sauropods nibbling at treetops just a few meters tall, or tiny hadrosaurs grazing in open meadows. It was a surreal world, as though nature had pressed the island into a smaller-scale model of the mainland. And then, in the midst of these scaled-down dinosaurs, rose a towering anomaly, Hatzegopteryx, a predator whose size defied the rules of island biology. From the moment it landed, folding its colossal wings and stalking the plains with deliberate strides, the hierarchy of the island was clear. Every creature, no matter how small or adapted,
lived under the shadow of the flying giant. Hatzeg Island was both a sanctuary of evolutionary oddities and a hunting ground ruled by one of the most terrifying predators in prehistory.
The uniqueness of Hatzeg Island didn't just shape the animals, it shaped their interactions and ultimately their survival strategies. In a limited environment, competition for food was fierce. Herbivores had to make do with less vegetation, which explained their reduced size. Predators, too, had to adapt, often becoming smaller or more opportunistic to survive. But Hatzegopteryx broke this rule spectacularly. Its immense size meant it didn't need to compete with smaller carnivores, it simply overpowered them. The dwarf predators of Hatzeg, such as small dromaeosaurs or crocodilians, posed no threat to a towering azhdarchid. Instead, Hatzegopteryx sat alone at the top of the food chain, free to feed on dwarf dinosaurs, mammals, amphibians, or whatever else it desired. Gregory Paul, in The Princeton Field Guide to Pterosaurs, 2022, emphasizes that Hatzegopteryx filled a role unlike any other pterosaur known, not just as a flyer, but as a dominant terrestrial hunter, a true apex predator on its island ecosystem. Picture the eerie balance of this environment. On one hand, you had miniature creatures evolved to cope with scarcity, tiny sauropods, shrunken duck-billed dinosaurs, and small mammals eking out survival. On the other hand, you had Hatzegopteryx, a contradiction to the island's rules, towering over its neighbors like a nightmare interloper. Imagine standing on a hillside, watching a herd of dwarf titanosaurs grazing, when suddenly the ground trembles as a shadow passes overhead. The herd scatters, their tiny frames vanishing into the forest, but the predator follows with calm precision. Its long strides cover the ground quickly, its colossal head scanning the clearing for stragglers. This was the Hatzeg paradox, an island where everything was small, except for its most terrifying inhabitant. Scientists still puzzle over how such a giant could thrive in an environment that should have selected against gigantism. Did its ability to cover vast distances by flight allow it to exploit multiple hunting grounds across the island? Did it dominate by feeding on a broad range of prey, from small mammals to dwarf dinosaurs? Whatever the case, Hatzeg Island remains one of the most compelling evolutionary laboratories in history, a place where isolation produced both tiny wonders and a haunting paradox. And in this paradox lies a haunting question. Was Hatzegopteryx nature's greatest exception, or the clearest proof that even the harshest rules of evolution can be broken?
To imagine the world of Hatzegopteryx, we must step beyond its massive wings and monstrous skull and look at the strange cast of creatures that shared its island home. Hatzeg Island, during the late Cretaceous, was a menagerie unlike anywhere else on Earth, a place where evolution bent the rules, shaping animals in curious and often unsettling ways. Among its most famous inhabitants were the dwarf titanosaurs, such as Magurosaurus, sauropods that in other parts of the world could reach 30 meters in length, but here grew no larger than elephants. Picture these small giants grazing in herds, their once mighty lineage reduced in size, but not in dignity. Alongside them were hadrosaurs like Telmatosaurus, also dwarfed compared to their North American relatives, yet still large enough to attract the attention of predators like Hatzegopteryx. These plant-eaters would have moved in small groups through the forests and floodplains, always wary of shadows crossing the sky. And then there were the ornithopods, smaller herbivorous dinosaurs that scuttled between ferns and low shrubs, quick but vulnerable, always at risk of being plucked up in the colossal beak of their flying overlord. The island was also home to predators, though none as fearsome as Hatzegopteryx. One such predator was Balar, Bondoc, a raptor-like dinosaur, sometimes nicknamed the stocky dragon. Unlike its swift and elegant relatives elsewhere,
Balar was unusually robust, with double sickle claws on each foot. Yet, despite its ferocity, it was still no match for the towering pterosaur. Imagine a balar creeping through the undergrowth, stalking small prey, when suddenly it freezes. Above, the shadow of Hatzegopteryx passes across the forest floor. For all its sharp claws and hunting skills, Balar would have been forced to yield, knowing instinctively that this titan sat unchallenged at the very top of the food chain. Alongside Balar lived small crocodiliomorphs, giant amphibians, and mammals no larger than modern rats. Some of these mammals, though tiny, were significant. They represent the ancestors of future lineages that would one day dominate Earth after the extinction of the dinosaurs. Yet here, on Hatzeg Island, they scurried quietly underfoot, insignificant in the shadow of giants. The coexistence of these animals painted a picture of an ecosystem both fragile and brutal, a miniature world where everything was vulnerable to the colossal hunter in the skies.
The diversity of Hatzeg Island's fauna also highlights the paradox of its ecosystem, a blend of creatures both diminished and terrifying. Imagine standing at the edge of a swamp. In the water, turtles bask on logs while amphibians splash below the surface. On the banks, dwarf sauropods shuffle in small herds, their long necks bending to pluck leaves from low trees. Suddenly, the reeds part and a balaur darts forward, seizing a small lizard. Yet before the predator can savor its meal, the air darkens. With a rush of wind, Hatzegopteryx descends, its colossal form blotting out the sun. The balaur, once hunter, becomes the hunted, retreating in fear as the giant pterosaur strides into the clearing. Its head, massive and spear-like, tilts downward, scanning the swamp for prey. The smaller dinosaurs scatter. In this frozen moment, the hierarchy of Hatzeg Island is clear. No predator, no matter how specialized or fierce, could ever challenge the dominance of the sky monster. And yet, this coexistence also shaped the island in subtler ways. The presence of Hatzegopteryx would have influenced the behavior of every creature it lived alongside. Herds of Majorosaurus likely stayed close together, their strength in numbers offering some illusion of safety. Hadrosaurs like Telmatosaurus probably evolved heightened awareness, lifting their heads to scan the skies as often as they grazed. Even Balaur may have restricted its hunting to dense forests, where the massive wings of Hatzegopteryx could not maneuver easily. Every choice, where to graze, when to move, how to hide, was dictated by the looming possibility of attack from above. In this sense, Hatzegopteryx was not just another predator, it was an architect of fear, shaping the very behavior and survival strategies of the animals around it. As Gregory Paul 2022 suggested, apex predators like this didn't just eat, they dictated the rhythm of entire ecosystems. And so, the creatures of Hatzeg Island lived not merely with Hatzegopteryx, but under it, their lives constantly balanced against the terrible reality of sharing a world with the largest flyer in history. And this raises the next question: what kind of climate allowed such an ecosystem to thrive? And how did that climate contribute to the rise of this monstrous predator?
To understand how Hatzegopteryx rose to such monstrous proportions, we must step back and look at the climate of its world. The late Cretaceous period, around 70 million years ago, was a time of warmth and abundance. Global temperatures were higher than today. Polar ice was virtually non-existent, and sea levels were so elevated that much of Europe was reduced to scattered islands in a shallow tropical archipelago. Hatzeg Island was one of these, a green jewel surrounded by warm inland seas. Imagine a climate more humid than modern-day Mediterranean regions, but with the persistent warmth of the subtropics. Forests of conifers, ferns, and cycads blanketed the landscape, while swamps and river deltas teemed with life.
It was a world where plants grew year-round, providing food for herds of dwarf herbivores. For a flying predator like Hatzegopteryx, this environment was close to ideal. Open plains for launching and hunting, rivers and wetlands that attracted prey, and a steady supply of thermals, rising columns of warm air that could carry its vast frame across the island with little effort. According to David E. Fastovsky and David B. Weishampel in The Evolution and Extinction of the Dinosaurs, 2005, the late Cretaceous greenhouse climate created ecosystems of remarkable productivity, fueling the gigantism of animals like titanosaurs, and, paradoxically, enabling both dwarfism and gigantism to coexist on islands such as Hatzeg. Visualize the atmosphere of Hatzeg Island during this time. A sun that shone hotter and longer than today, skies often hazy with humidity, and sudden summer storms rolling across the shallow seas. The air itself was likely richer in carbon dioxide, fostering rapid plant growth and maintaining the lush forests that fed the herbivores. For Hatzegopteryx, these conditions were crucial. The warm climate generated the thermals it needed to sustain flight, while the year-round productivity ensured that prey was always available. Unlike modern large birds that migrate vast distances to track seasonal resources, Hatzegopteryx could remain in its territory, confident that the climate would continue to provide. This stability may have been one of the keys to its survival. In a world without freezing winters, food chains remained intact, and the aerial giant had no need to risk dangerous long-range migrations. In essence, Hatzeg's climate was a perfect incubator, sustaining a predator that pushed the limits of size and flight.
Yet the climate also imposed challenges, shaping Hatzegopteryx's life in subtle ways. Warm, shallow seas around Hatzeg Island meant storms and flooding were common. Seasonal rains may have turned low-lying floodplains into vast wetlands, forcing herbivores to cluster on higher ground. For Hatzegopteryx, these fluctuations were both opportunities and risks. Floods might concentrate prey into smaller areas, making hunting easier, but storms could also disrupt soaring flight, grounding even the greatest of flyers. Imagine the colossal creature caught in a sudden thunderstorm, wings buffeted by wind, lightning illuminating its silhouette against a blackened sky, forced to land and wait for calmer air. Such moments would have reminded even this apex predator that, despite its power, it was still at the mercy of the elements. The greenhouse climate also meant the island was a hotbed of evolutionary experimentation. Limited space and constant warmth pushed species into unusual directions. Dwarfism in herbivores, robustness in predators, and gigantism in pterosaurians. Darren Naish and Mark Whitten, in their broader discussions of pterosaur paleoecology, note that climate acted as both enabler and limiter, allowing giants like Hatzegopteryx to flourish, but also setting tight constraints on their physiology. For instance, soaring in hot and humid air could be energy efficient, but overheating posed a serious danger for such massive animals. Perhaps the wings of Hatzegopteryx, stretched with vascularized membranes, doubled as radiators, shedding excess heat during long flights. These adaptations would have been silent testimonies to the pressures of its environment. And so, the climate of Hatzeg was both cradle and crucible, nurturing a giant predator while constantly testing its limits. The thought is haunting. Hatzegopteryx was not merely a product of its genes, but of its skies, its storms, and its warmth. Which leads us to an inevitable end to the story. What happens when the climate shifts, the seas withdraw,
and the Cretaceous comes crashing to a close. No matter how dominant, no matter how terrifying, even Hatzegopteryx could not escape the great curtain call of the Cretaceous. Around 66 million years ago, a cosmic disaster reshaped life on Earth forever. A massive asteroid, estimated to be 10 kilometers across, struck the Yucatan Peninsula in what is now Mexico, unleashing a cataclysm known as the Chicxulub impact. Within moments, firestorms raced across continents, tsunamis swallowed coastlines, and shockwaves rippled around the globe. But it was not the initial impact that sealed the fate of giants like Hatzegopteryx. It was the aftermath. Dust, ash, and sulfuric aerosols filled the sky, blotting out sunlight for months, perhaps years. Photosynthesis collapsed, plants withered, and the food chains built upon them crumbled. On Hatzeg Island, the once lush forests turned to wastelands. The thermals that sustained giant flight dissipated in a darkened atmosphere, and the delicate balance that had allowed Hatzegopteryx to dominate came undone. As David Archibald explains in Extinction and Radiation, How the Fall of Dinosaurs Led to the Rise of Mammals, 2011, the KPG extinction was less a single blow than a prolonged ecological unraveling. For a giant predator dependent on plentiful prey and stable climates, survival was impossible. Picture Hatzeg in those final days. The dwarf titanosaurs, once grazing in herds, collapse from hunger as vegetation withers. Amphibians vanish from dried-out swamps. Mammals scurry in vain for food, and smaller predators fight over scraps. Above, Hatzegopteryx circles weakly, its massive wings cutting across a sky dimmed by ash. But there are no thermals to lift it higher, no prey herds to strike. Even the act of flight becomes an energy-draining risk. Perhaps some tried to adapt, scavenging what carcasses they could find. But a giant predator cannot live on scraps alone. In time, the great flyer is forced down, its colossal wings folded in defeat. A creature that once ruled both air and land is reduced to struggling for survival in a collapsing ecosystem. And then, like so many of its contemporaries, dinosaurs, marine reptiles, and ammonites, it vanishes, leaving behind only fragments of bone buried in the sediment. The skies grow silent, empty of giants. The reign of pterosaurs, which had lasted for over 150 million years, comes to a sudden, final end.
And yet, extinction does not erase legacy. Though Hatzegopteryx itself vanished, its story lives on in the rocks and in the imagination it inspires. The extinction of giants like Hatzegopteryx cleared the stage for a new cast of characters. Birds, the last surviving branch of flying dinosaurs, inherited the skies. Mammals, once scurrying in the shadows, rose to fill the vacant niches, eventually giving rise to primates and, much later, to us. But the fossils of Hatzegopteryx remind us of a lost chapter, a time when the sky belonged not to birds, but to reptilian monsters of unimaginable size. As Mark Whitten reflects in Pterosaurs 2013, creatures like Hatzegopteryx push our understanding of what evolution can achieve, demonstrating that flight itself is not bound by the limits we often assume. They were nature's grandest experiment in conquering the air. And though that experiment ended, its echoes remain in every soaring bird, every glider catching the wind. Imagine standing today in the Hatzeg Basin. The fields are quiet, dotted with villages and rolling hills. But beneath the soil lie bones that tell a story of terror, dominance, and sudden annihilation. Close your eyes and the landscape transforms.
Dwarf dinosaurs graze in the distance, amphibians croak from the swamps, and far above, the shadow of Hatzegopteryx glides silently across the ground. In that moment, you glimpse the world as it once was, a world where the largest animal ever to fly stalked both the skies and the land, unchallenged, until the universe itself intervened to end its reign. And so the tale closes, not with triumph, but with the haunting reminder that no creature, no matter how mighty, is immune to extinction. Perhaps the more important question we should ask ourselves is this: if Hatzegopteryx, a predator so perfectly adapted and so utterly dominant, could be erased in an instant, what does that say about the fragility of life today? As you ponder this, remember that every shadow overhead carries a fragment of their legacy, and every flight of a bird is a whisper of the giants that once ruled the skies.
When we look back at the story of Hatzegopteryx, we are not merely piecing together the bones of a long-dead creature. We are rediscovering one of evolution's boldest experiments, a predator that stretched the limits of size, strength, and flight until it became something that feels almost mythical. This was no fragile giant, no delicate glider barely holding itself together in the air. This was a sky-born monster with a head larger than a human body, a neck built like a pillar of stone, and wings that spanned wider than the length of a house. It stalked an island of dwarf dinosaurs, preying upon the weak, terrorizing the small, and rewriting the rules of what a flying animal could be. And then, in an instant measured not by millions of years, but by a single cosmic impact, it was gone. Its reign ended not because it failed, but because the world around it collapsed. In that silence, life reshaped itself, leaving behind only fossils and echoes of wings that once blotted out the sun. Standing in the present, with birds soaring overhead and mammals dominating the land, we are left with a sobering truth. Even the mightiest are at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Hatzegopteryx reminds us that extinction is not just a story of the past, but a constant shadow in the story of life, a reminder of fragility, but also of resilience, because from the ashes of giants came the seeds of our own existence. So the next time you see a bird glide effortlessly across the sky, pause and imagine the shadow of its ancestor, a monster whose flight was both beautiful and terrifying. What other secrets lie buried, waiting to be uncovered? And what other creatures once pushed evolution to its limits before vanishing forever? If stories like these spark your curiosity, if you find yourself wanting to journey deeper into the forgotten worlds of prehistory, then I invite you to join us again. Subscribe to this channel, explore more of our documentaries, and keep walking with us through the corridors of deep time, where every fossil whispers the tale of a world we almost can't believe once existed.